Okay, so we've got this lovely opportunity today, haven't we, Janine, to talk about some of our shared histories and where we're up to with Early Break. So just to introduce ourselves, I'm Vicky Maloney. I'm Chief Executive Officer at Early Break, Young People's Substance Misuse Service, operating in Greater Manchester in England.
And I'm Janine Day. I'm the Operations Director here at Early Break.
So take me back to the 90s, Janine.
Okay. So we're going to take people a bit on the journey around the drug scene in the UK and how we've responded to it in terms of young people's substance use. So I'm going way, way back, once upon a time, back to the early 90s. And at that time, it was the time in the UK where we was moving away from abstinence-based approaches to substance use and starting to look at harm reduction. And that was off the back of HIV and AIDS. So my first work was at a charity, working for a charity, and it was around when ecstasy use was exploding in the country. And what we couldn't understand is why young people was taking this drug, having a great time, and then overeating, and in extreme circumstances there was fatalities.
Yeah.
So as a team of outreach workers, we would go into the nightclubs and speak to young people and look at what they was using, how they was using, what was great about it, and what were some of the tricky situations that they ended up getting into. From the research information, we take that back and we worked with a fantastic researcher and designer called Michael Linnell. Now, Michael would take the information from the research team and turn that into very funny, a lot of humour, quite cutting sometimes, harm reduction messages. And Michael's work became, I suppose, really recognised both nationally and internationally. And people used to collect the publications and the harm reduction messages. So that was my first entry, really, from mental health services into drug and alcohol services. I then went on, I suppose, as the government released funding to reduce harms around substance use. Then again, my role expanded and I went working in the city of Manchester, getting people into drug treatment. And from there, I quite quickly then went and worked in the prisons, so working within a prison setting, and looking at how we set up through care and resettlement services for young substance users. So I suppose that's where your journey starts.
So at a similar time, Early Break as an organisation was formed in 1994, and the story is, you know this story, it was literally a phone line in somebody's shed. And that was about there wasn't the services there, exactly like you're describing, Janine. And it got a lottery grant, which was funding at the time, I think it was 1997. And you just named that, some of the criminal justice stuff like the PACE in 2000, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act changed things, where we had the split between adults and young people's services around criminal justice, which was a route where we were catching a lot of the young people. So my first role was in one of the youth justice roles, specific obviously to young people, and that was in 2001. Joined the service, and obviously working with that profile, it was the ACE profile, which was the alcohol, cannabis, cocaine and ecstasy, in terms of where we're at. Very different now, of course, but that's what we were working with at the time in terms of drug markets, and obviously linking across our services across GM.
And that's interesting because that's where our paths first collided. When I was working in the prisons, I would invite Early Break into the prisons to promote the support that the young people could get once they was released from prison, because that's when we locked young people up for using drugs or having drugs, holding drugs, how things have changed, thankfully, since then. And I think for me, I always loved Early Break and held great respect for it, because it was the first young people's drug and alcohol service that was designed just to be a drug and alcohol service, unlike other services that was born out of adult drug treatment services. So you was very unique, you was very child-centred and family-focused.
And that's remained, hasn't it? If you think about the things that we design today, I know we're going to talk about that later in our conversation, it's always rooted in what do our young people think, what are they telling us, even in our response to the COVID stuff, where young people are. That is the strength still that we've kept hold of, isn't it? It sits with us to do that, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And I suppose that kind of leads quite nicely in, was it 2001, when there was a national spending review and the government made a decision to say, actually, young people's drug and alcohol services need to be separate from an adult drug treatment provider. And that's when there was an injection of money into the country so that we could develop and our own young people and families drug and alcohol services. So that's when practice really started to develop, wasn't it, with that national investment.
And they had, if you can remember, essential elements, which was all the core things around what was right in terms of young people's practice. So guidance around how we did assessments of young people, how we developed their care plans and what young people need. And then there were the SCODA guidelines in terms of how we work with young people, really, really rooted in, again, what you've just said, that it is about meeting young people where they're at in terms of their development. And I think that's key. That's key.
And I think some of that, looking holistically at young people's needs. So it wasn't just about the health harms that they was exposing themselves to or, engaging in, but it was also the social risks and then the legal risks. And thankfully now practice has come along that if young people are using or holding drugs, then quite often it's seen as, there's generally an adult behind that and considered as exploitation.
And that vulnerability.
Absolutely, to safeguard and protect the children and young people.
Because I think in terms of what our workers are doing now in front of young people, that word holistic that we've both said there, Janine, it is about, well, what's going on in this child's life. So it is potentially about safeguarding them. It is about what's the home like and what's going on with the parents. Who are they friends with and how are they spending their time? Are they engaged in education or employment? So it's that whole look at a child's life in terms of where we come at it and do our care planning and put things in place for them.
And one of the things that you was instrumental in is holding families.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because I forgot that bit.
So just talk to us about holding families.
Well, that was, again, until we're going back, 21 years now. So on a national footing, there was a report called Hidden Harm, which was about young people who were living with parental substance use. And we were seeing those young people in treatment services and there wasn't anything that addressed their needs. And sometimes those young people didn't have their own treatment need because they were making choices for themselves not to use substances because of how distressing their lives had been. But again, they'd had that trauma of living with that. And I think trauma is something that we're working very hard with in terms of what does it mean in practice, but rooted in when we started off understanding that intergenerational substance use, what that meant for those young people. So we started our first step in the water back in 2003, where we worked with 5 families, that's all it was, around a whole family approach. And you have picked up the baton from that in terms of your time as you joined Early Break in 2013. And that's been very much developing it into the prisons, back to prison work later in time, and a bit around that whole family approach, which I think we're really strong with.
Yeah. And I think we was lucky in that we was awarded some national innovation monies. So it was able to build on the Holding Families programme, which was excellent and is still excellent in facilitating change. It's evidence-based, it's researched, it's evaluated. But we then wanted to say, well, if we put a trauma lens on this and look at intergenerational trauma, starting with adverse childhood experiences, and then looking at, intergenerational criminality, substance use, etc., will it change the way that we work with families? And it's been a great journey and really has. And obviously we've been influenced by Gabor Mate and his work, and Van der Kolk, Body Keeps the Score. So, You know, we've kind of used all the recent research and evidence bases that's coming through and really helped us to design our services, but with the involvement of the families and the young people. So if I think about that work on Holding Families Plus, we went into the prisons and asked them mothers, what do you need right now as a mother in prison for you and your children? And that's how we developed and designed our service. And that's how we've developed and designed all our services. That's been the early break model.
And Janine, just that child's voice in that as well, that real bit, you know, it's hidden harm for a reason, isn't it? And there's something for me about even now, the training the last couple of weeks where we've been doing some training with social care around thinking about where does cannabis impact on a family when it's been played down. Even today, just like really rooting it in what's behind and trying to influence other services in terms of how they think about young substance users. So that child-centred policing work, as an example, that we've tried to have the conversations with there. Some of the work that we're doing in housing, in terms of that trauma-based stuff that we've got. So I think really, like we always say, punching above our weight, really, don't we, in terms of how we try and take that child's voice into different arenas to change practice. I think that's a top tip walk away for colleagues today.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm just thinking about some of our working during COVID and the recognition around young people's emotional and mental health. Do you want to talk a little bit?
No, because I'm going to be stealing where we've got to, because the key thing in that for me was the emerging then of the stressed out brain work. And stressed out brain was, again, it's lovely, isn't it? Because you've been able to talk about Michael's work in the 90s back into bringing Michael back into what we're doing now in 2022, 23 around. It was, for me, stressed out brain is where we've been able to create something so young people have their own understanding of what's going on for themselves in terms of trauma, in terms of that functioning of the brain, the cells, then they can own it in terms of that decision making, harm reduction, and that bit around how they can self-regulate some of that stuff, which has the knock-on, of course, in terms of reducing the substance use and reducing other risk-taking behaviour that they're involved in.
And yeah, I mean, I think it's important to say as well, when we speak to young people, it's not just a handful of young people. There was over 200 young people worked with as part of the stressed out brain. And that involved surveying young people and working alongside the university to make sure what we was doing had an evidence base and it was credible. And then taking the information from the surveys into delivering interviews with young people to understand their adverse life experiences, and speaking to young people and asking them what conversations would it have been helpful to have with professionals to prevent you from getting from where you are now. And actually that was really powerful. They said, you know, we didn't know about adverse life experience. We didn't know about our brain development. Why has no one spoke to us about this before? We just think we're a nuisance in our community. So it was really good. And they helped us. Not only did they help us develop the stressed out brain animation because they wanted something that was creative and engaging, but they also helped us develop that professional training. So what interventions they identified, the range of interventions that would help young people from early adolescence. So that's about emotional health and well-being, sleep hygiene, you know, looking at stress, anxiety, looking at the neurological brain development, and how that impacts on their ability to emotionally regulate, and then living in stressful environments. And obviously, school can be a part of that, negotiating and navigating relationships, not only with your peers, but as you grow older in adolescence, within your personal and private relationships and family relationships. So stressed out brain's a big thing, really, because it's professional training and it's interventions for young people.
But it's shifted, hasn't it? If you think how we set off in this conversation, even with a criminal justice focus, we know that many of our young people are in mental health services or waiting to access mental health services, which are struggling as services. this supports that as well, doesn't it, in terms of where they are. The routes into treatment services have changed, and this is really responsive to that.
Absolutely, and I think now we really recognise from our family work into our emotional and mental health services in early break that we recognise the earlier that we can work with young people that have experienced difficulties or adverse life experiences that's going to impact on their emotional well-being, the more support that we can provide them and coping skills and strategies, then the better they are, I suppose, set up to prevent risk-taking behaviours emerging at an earlier age.
And it's a brilliant part of the menu for me, Janine, because it's that bit around the understanding yourself, your mental health bit, but those other dead specific techniques on harm reduction for each of the substances that they're presenting with. And it's changed, hasn't it? We've moved from that ACE profile to a mix of different substances that we're working with now. So that whole bit around addressing that with them, looking at like what's going on for them in the week, the drink and the drug diaries, who are they with, what does it mean for them, that whole bit, it just enhances the package that our young people get in terms of addressing the risk that they're taking.
Yeah, and that actually substance use no longer isn't a mental health issue as such, but actually it's a symptom quite often of a traumatic event, or it's about those children and young people being exposed to exploitative relationships. Now, whether that's criminal exploitation, where young people are carrying and transporting drugs or holding drugs, it's still an exploitative situation where young people need to be supported and protected.
Tricky stuff.
Yeah. So if you haven't seen Stressed Out Brain, then I can recommend that you go to stressedoutbrain@earlybreak.co.uk, have a look at the film that was co-produced, co-designed by young people, and you can also download the resources that they feel is helpful for them during adolescence. Thanks.